Dear friends, welcome to this beautiful city of Trieste, where we're going to have our dynamic coalition session on data and trust live from Trieste. And here I am, Giovanni Seppia, EuroDIG External Relations Manager. So welcome to the dynamic coalition on data and trust session, and welcome to Trieste.
Welcome to Trieste. My name's Emily Taylor, and I'm your co-moderator today. Trieste sits at the intersection between sea and land, mountains and the rest of Europe. And like the domain name system, it's a narrow strategic function that enables people to come together and communicate. And like this lighthouse, the domain name system is a guiding light that tells people where they are and how to navigate as they work their way through the internet.
And with those words, let's launch our dynamic coalition session on data and trust. Are you ready, Emily?
Yes, Giovanni. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Dynamic Coalition on Data and Trust session. Today, we're going to be talking about all aspects of the DNS from the perspective of multiple stakeholders. We have got a very practical aspect to today, and we're going to hear from stakeholders who rely on the DNS to do their work and what they need in order to improve data quality and trust in the DNS. So we've got lots of dilemmas. We're going to be involving you as the audience as much as possible. After a quick fire session with our panelists, we're going to really be digging into the topics in our roundtable. So let's introduce you first to our co-moderator and community host, Giovanni Seppia from EuroDIG. Thank you, Giovanni.
Thank you so much, Emily. And indeed, here we are, live from Trieste, this beautiful town, which is virtually hosting EuroDIG, but we are live in Trieste today. And we are like to set the scene for the engagement because we want this session to be as dynamic as our coalition. So we want you really to engage with us and interact with us. And there are plenty of ways you can do that via the chat and also via these polls that we will launch on the menti.com platform. And please look at the chat for the way you can get into these polls. And also there is a code at the top of the screen for those polls. Let's launch immediately the very first poll, which is a poll divided into two parts. First question of the poll is, where are you joining us from? And I can see already, okay, Carlo, we have a speaker from there, and we will introduce him soon. And then, yes, Trieste, very good. Nothing more? No other places? But we have Pennsylvania, so thank you for joining us. That's the middle of the night. Yeah, Trieste is now getting the lead. India, very good. Okay, Mark Monitor. I don't know if there is any country called Mark Monitor, but I'm certainly in office and certainly one of our registrars. So thank you so much. And the next question is, where would you rather be right now? Okay, Spain, I understand people think about holidays. There's parts of the world that are indeed into the holiday mode. Trieste, yes, that is where we wish you were with us today. Here is fine. Wow, that's also very good. And Andaman, wow, okay, that's far away. Not so sure about the COVID procedures to get into that. And the session room, indeed. So thank you so much for answering those two questions. And now we are getting more into the, let's say, nitty-gritty details of this session with the next two questions. And the next two questions, the first one is regarding data and trust. What do you think is the most important issue? And we have 5 topics, starting from tackling cybercrime, improving transparency, enhancing data quality, empowering young generations, and protecting intellectual property rights. Please express your preference, cast your preference in the poll. You see that improving transparency is, and empowering young generations is, okay, tackling cybercrime is again at the top. It's like a horse race. I like it. Okay, certainly tackling cybercrime is the winner. So we'll speak about that. And the final question of the very first is a dilemma, which is quite soft. Where would you like to be right now? Seaside or mountains? Okay, seaside. Seaside is winning.
Lots
definitely.
of seaside, lots of love for the seaside at the moment.
And honestly, and I don't want to be nasty, but we have a nice sea view behind us. So, yeah, seaside is winning. Okay, so thank you so much. This was the just very first poll. We'll have more later on. Please continue to cast your preference and interact with us via the chat, and also participating in the poll. So, that said, we move on.
Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in those polls. And we're seeing already that when people are thinking about priorities for the DNS, almost everything is up there as a major priority. And we've going to be joined today by a wide variety of speakers. So without further ado, let's meet our first guest, who is Bogdan Cuinaru from Europol. Welcome, Bogdan. Bogdan, we're thrilled to have you here this morning. Where are you joining us from?
Good morning. I'm joining from the headquarters of Europol, from The Hague, from the Netherlands. And also I'm very pleased to be here and to attend this conference and to support EuroDIG, because we are working quite well with EuroDIG, and up until now we had a very fruitful cooperation, and we hope to keep it the same for the next years.
Thank you. And maybe you could just set the scene for us for a little, from the perspective of your role in law enforcement, thinking particularly about DNS data. What are you finding are the challenges for law enforcement in cybercrime and mitigating threats to online trust?
Thank you very much for the question. First, I would like to introduce a little bit what my team is doing. We are I'm part of a team that is dealing with different challenges related to the intellectual property rights. So we are dealing with intellectual property rights, but also we are dealing with the cybercrime aspects of the intellectual property rights, because I saw also on the poll, it was mentioned that it's important to tackle the cybercrime and to protect the IP rights. It was the fifth So the first was tackling the cybercrime, which is quite interesting because what we are trying to do, me and my team, we are trying to focus on the aspects of the intellectual property rights related to the online aspect. So we are looking for the internet in general, for dark web, open web. So we are doing a wide variety. So we are also looking for products that are sold online. We are looking for torrent websites, IPTV, illegal IPTV. So that's why to tackle this kind of crimes is quite challenging nowadays. As you know, it is each country. I'm speaking only in Europe, but also I can speak broadly outside the Europe. Only in Europe we have a lot of issues with the registries from different domains. We have different legislation, for example, to take down a domain, to investigate a domain. We have a lot of issues to educate the consumers, because all the time the consumers are not are looking for the best opportunities. They are not looking for a safe domain or a domain that can be trusted. So this is one of the issues that we are facing in general, and which is also in the benefit of the criminals. And even so, we are as you saw, if you're looking at Europol website, all the time you'll see that a lot of domains are taking down each year. You'll see that we are, let's say, one step behind, one step upper than the criminals, because all the time we manage to get them, we manage to monitor them, we manage to be proactive several times. And of course, we have a lot of challenges, like the new GDPR, which was a challenge a while ago. Now we managed to overlap it. It was quite challenging for us to be able to investigate the domains again, because it was quite hard for us to not be able to do the formal investigation as we were doing it before. So more or less, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is the different legislation that is applying in all the countries, which is related to in general about the online crime. And this is very hard for the investigators to focus. And the same, we need to know that the law enforcement authority have a legal aspect of investigation. So we need the rogatory letters, we need the European investigation orders to investigate the cyber criminals, while the cyber criminals are free on the market and they do not care about any kind of rules or any kind of legislation, because they can be anywhere in Europe. For us, we need to work, and that's why Europol is here to support the law enforcement authorities. And also we need all the time also the support from the private sector, and that's why I'm pleased to be able to work with you and with EuroDIG and with other similar institutions that can support us in our fight, and other private partners from different areas.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Bogdan. There is a lot in there which I hope we can come back to in the round table. For example, as you mentioned, the challenges of GDPR for law enforcement and what can be done about that, but also your emphasis on takedowns and the emphasis on cooperation both between law enforcement partners and what the challenges are there, and also industry players. Lots and lots to unpack, but before we can do that, let's meet our second speaker, who is joining us from the European Intellectual Property Office, and he is Antoine Aubert. Good morning, Antoine. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing fine.
Great to have you with us. So we heard just now from Bogdan about the challenges of GDPR. From your perspective in the European Intellectual Property Office, can you tell us why access to good quality DNS registration data is essential for your work? So maybe we can start with that. Thank you, Antoine.
Yeah, I would also like to talk about what we're doing and the collaborative effort and collaborative action we're taking. I think, as Bogdan pointed out, when we're talking about access to data, all investigation into abuse of domain name start with data. So it is important to get access and see this data, even to realize that these are fraudulent or fake data, which is already an indication. I would like to talk about what we're doing when it comes to trying to improve the system and the trust in the domain name system, and the collaboration we have with EuroDIG. We've been setting up and we have a long-established collaboration with EuroDIG, where we've been setting up an alarm system where EU trademark owner or EU trademark holder can opt in to receive an alert if their trademark is registered as a .eu. And so they can get an early warning if somebody is trying to register their trademark as a domain. We're also looking at ways to bring together the registration of trademark and EU domain closer together. And so one thing we're doing is we're notably showing the availability of trademark as EU domain at the end of the trademark application process. So if you apply for a trademark, at the end of your application process, you will see if the EU domain is available, and then you will be able to register. Going to data and data accuracy, I would also like to point at some of the work we've been doing on good practices from registrar and registry to prevent the misuse of domain name for IP infringement activity, and a discussion paper we published back in March 2021, so this year, where we've been identifying a number of good practices that are relevant when we're talking about data accuracy, and in particular registry that are monitoring registration data to detect abusive registration even before delegation. And so EuroDIG is active in that field with its abuse system. We see DNS Belgium, the .be, also working on its registrant verification project. And we also see a number of good practices with registries that are proactively checking registrant data after registration, so after delegation, or proactively or reactively based on notification on suspicious activity on domain. So I think there's a number of good practices in that field that are interested to look at, and that's what we've been doing with this discussion paper. I think the added value of the discussion paper pointed at the advantage of this approach that is not based on any assessment of the legality of the content or the services that is associated with the domain, but is only based on the obligation for the registrant to provide accurate data. So one way not to focus so much on the content of a website or the services that are made available through a domain, but really on the accuracy and of the registrant data. So we hope that this discussion paper can contribute to the discussion on how to prevent the misuse of domain for IP infringing activities.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for that introduction, and also to referencing your paper and also the cooperative actions that you've been doing with EuroDIG, both in the collaboration over trademarks, but also in identifying potentially abusive domains before they're activated. And I hope that in the roundtable we can come back to these collaborative actions and working between the institutions and the industry, and maybe exploring whether what you're seeing is just sort of little pockets of good practice, or whether we could start to say there is a trend in this. But first of all, let us go to our next guest, who is joining us here live in Trieste, a dear friend, Bertrand de la Chapelle, from the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. Bertrand, welcome to the session today. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And we were just hearing from Antoine about the distinction just starting to come through. When we're talking in the DNS, we talk about the distinction between content and DNS data. Now, I would love you to explain your project, your policy network's new toolkit to help registries and registrars combat DNS abuse, which seems to me a very, very practical input into this debate. Thank you for introducing it today, Bertrand.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure being here. Before doing that, I want to remind people of something more general, which is that the internet was built on trust, and that's why it was successful. And it has actually accomplished an amazing increase in the level of what is called impersonal trust. The notion that you can spontaneously trust somebody that you don't know, you've never seen, never heard of. And that's an achievement, and that's the way humans function. The second thing is that when we talk about abuse, we're not familiar with a situation where the abuses online are extremely small in proportion and massive in volume. So there's a cognitive dissonance here that is completely different situation from the life in the physical world. So coming back to your question, the question of DNS abuse is actually a misnomer. Because it's not the DNS that is abusive, it's people that are making abuses online, and you can make a distinction between two dimensions. One is technical abuse and the other one is abusive content. And these have to be addressed in a very different way because the capacity of the DNS operators are vastly different on one and on the other. Particularly because when you take action at the DNS level, you have a massive global action. You switch off. I mean, there are different actions you can take, but you switch off a domain. And so it is extremely relevant, and the companies are able to make those evaluations when it is about technical abuse much easier than when it is about content abuse, because they don't necessarily have the capacity and the competence. So what we've been doing in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network is we have a contact group dedicated to the question, which is not DNS abuse, which is when is it appropriate to act at the DNS level to address abuses. And the answers get around thresholds, it gets around what are the procedures, because these are transnational issues. And transnational issues require transnational processes. And they require going beyond the actual mistrust between the actors, because there is mistrust between the governments, the operators, and the notifiers, because there's a triangle here. And the goal of the toolkit that we released in April, which is the product of the work of a contact group of about 40 people that have worked during 3 years to produce very practical and concrete elements that can be useful for the different actors. And it's structured in the following way. One, it is structured around the different stages, identification of abuses, who does it and how, evaluation of whether there is an abuse that requires an action, the choice of the action, because there are different actions, only a limited number of them, but there are different actions that can be taken. And then what are the avenues for recourse? And just to finish, the structure of the toolkit itself is structured around the general flow of those 4 elements, and more precisely a second part that deals specifically with phishing and malware, including in describing due diligence steps for the notifiers themselves, the components for the notices, because the better the notices, the easier it is to act upon them, the decision-making guide for the operators themselves when they evaluate and choose the action, and a very graphical workflow that distributes the responsibilities between the registrars, the registries, the notifiers, and the law enforcement.
Bertrand, thank you for that very concise introduction. And, you know, looking at the toolkit, I was really struck by how practical it is. It is something that you could put into the hands of a registry or registrar, and they would know what to do. And then hopefully it would ease the process. And those watchwords that you've mentioned about proportionality and due diligence, I hope we can come back to in the roundtable. But
it's important for notifiers and law enforcement as well.
And also this sort of the transnational, your overall goal of the sort of legal interoperability, which I hope we can explore with our speakers from Europol and EU IPO as well. So with that, let me now hand over, stay with us for the roundtable. Let me now hand over to Giovanni Seppia, who will introduce our next guests. Thank you.
So our next guest is with extreme pleasure here with us in Trieste is Thomas Costello. Thomas, thank you so much for coming here to Trieste and be with us today. I know it was not a long trip, but it was still a trip. How was the trip?
It was perfect.
Perfect.
Perfect sunny day, perfect scenery. Very nice.
That's very good. No major border checks?
None whatsoever.
That's so good. So getting to the business and to the topic of this session, you are a Slovenian registrar. From your perspective as a registrar, as a Slovenian registrar with a good portfolio of domain names, what actions have you taken or are you doing on a regular basis to ensure the quality of the registrant data of the domain names in your portfolio? Thank you, Thomas.
Sure. Actually, we believe in the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we do a lot of preventative measures. For example, when a client registers with us, we use a system that connects directly to the business registry so that when they enter the information, it is checked in the business registry to make sure everything is the same. And also we have a couple of tools for fraud checks. So this enables us to catch the potentially fraudulent registrations and prevent any trouble in the future. So recently, we were contacted during the first COVID wave. We were contacted by the registries to make sure that registrations, which included COVID terms, were not fraudulent. So in that period, we were also doing manual checks. But other than that, we haven't had any major issues. I think about 6 months ago, the Slovenian registry did a complete check of all the domain registrants in the system, and out of, I think we have around 43,000 domains, there were only 25 potentially fraudulent registrations, and even when you check those, it was just mistakes or nothing out of the ordinary. So this approach seems to be working for us.
Thank you so much, Thomas. We'll get back on that later on. Thank you again for coming. That said, I'm going to introduce the next guest who's joining us remotely, Michele Nilon from Black Knight Registrar.
Good morning, Giovanni. Good morning.
Good morning, Michele. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. Beautiful Irish weather.
What does it mean? What does it mean?
It means it's not raining this morning, okay?
Okay, so
we're doing well. We're doing well.
We have to look at the positive side always, no?
Exactly, and my tomatoes are growing, so I'm happy.
Okay. So, Michele, first of all, thank you so much for being with us, although we wanted you to be here, but we'll make sure that soon we'll get together. And I have my first question, which is if there is, we went through a lot of checks and a lot of, we read a lot of news about the pandemic, about abuses of domain names during the pandemic. Is there anything you think that registrars should have done differently in terms of, let's say, combat DNS abuse with reference to the domain names they have in their portfolio?
Well, I think, Giovanni, when it comes to abuse, obviously, it's an ongoing thing. I mean, there's always going to be a certain degree of abuse online. However, a lot of what we've seen over the last 18 months from being pushed from certain governments and from certain registries was, in my view, completely insane. I mean, it made no sense whatsoever. This idea that magically, if you do extra checks on a subset of domain names that contain certain magical keywords, you're somehow going to fix all online fraud. And during this pandemic, I mean, a lot of businesses were switching to online. So the attack surface obviously got bigger, but at the same time, the internet, from our perspective, it's for helping businesses. It's not for us to spend our time worrying about the 1 or 2% of people, of organizations or whatever, that might do something criminal, something fraudulent. So what we ended up with was this kind of situation where a lot of genuine businesses were having issues registering domain names because of this really dumb, blunt system that was being forced by the European Commission to check keywords. Whereas, the bigger picture thing is, you should be looking at actual abuse of resources. And in many cases, I think the issue doesn't lie with the registries or the registrars. It lies with, the hosting providers. It lies with ISPs. It lies in other parts of the chain. The problem, of course, is that it's far too easy to look at those of us within the system that are easy to reach, so that registries and registrars were easy targets. So I think in some respects, I mean, a lot of what Bertrand's talking about the idea of the doing due diligence, the proportionality, that's the kind of stuff that we need to be all looking at all the time, whether there's a pandemic or not, rather than this kind of pre-crime rubbish, which I see as being a potential attack on the freedom of speech.
Thank you so much, Michele. Very, very, very wise words. And indeed, internet is meant to help us and has been helping us a lot during the pandemic. With that said, we'll come back on some of the points you highlighted in your first response soon. I'd just like to remind everybody participating, attending this meeting remotely, to interact with us via the chat. We will collect questions that may come through the chat, and we'll ask questions to the panelists later on during the roundtable. That said, we are going to move to our next speaker, João Martins from the EuroDIG Youth Committee. Thank you, João, for coming to Trieste. It's a pleasure to have you here as well. I also know that for you the trip was not so long. You were just next door. You happen to be next door. Before I ask you the initial question, I like to explain that, just to say that EuroDIG launched the EuroDIG Youth Committee in 2020, and the EuroDIG Youth Committee is meant to provide advice to EuroDIG management on internet governance-related matter with fresh eyes, the eyes of youngsters, those new generations that are using internet in many different ways than, let's say, the more adult generations. And that said, João, what do you think is the perception of data and trust at the level of the young generation? And again, thank you for being the chair of the EuroDIG Youth Committee. João, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giovanni, and also Emily for guiding the conversation today. I guess I'm the last generation who got some years of their childhood without the full-fledged impact of the online environment. And this only means that nowadays the generations who come after me and after my generation are somehow exposed from an early age to the internet. I guess this, when we speak about data and trust, probably it's not DNS abuse or cybercrime will pop up into young people top of their minds, but this does not mean that young generations do not care. I guess the proliferation of social media usage, it's what somehow has been putting pressure and challenges on the topic right now. Because as Bertrand was saying, I guess this generation now is willing to change privacy for the comfort of using services. And when we speak about this, there's also the not yet fully addressed questions of legislation, transparency, auditing of the services that young people is consuming and using through the online environment. And there's this notion that young generations are very tech savvy, but from my understanding, it's from an end user perspective. I have an engineer background, a technical engineer background, so I'm aware to understand some technicalities of how my data is being used, but this does not mean that the whole youth is aware of this and might fall for some unintended consequences of this use. And I guess that's where the trust word comes or enters in place. And to keep brief my introduction, I guess the punchline is that young people are certainly a very important research group, because somehow it provides hints for the wider internet group. And as you mentioned, Giovanni, that's also part of the responsibility that we as part of the EuroDIG Youth Committee try to address and try to provide feedback also to the DNS industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, João. Interesting words from the young generations that are a nice bridge to take us to the next part of this session, which is about the roundtable. Emily, on to you.
Thank you. We're now going to open up the floor to questions. So please just put your questions in the chat. While you're thinking about, asking questions, we're going to continue with our first poll. Giovanni.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. Indeed, we have a poll. There are 4 questions waiting for you, 2 dilemmas. And the first dilemma is about registrants. There is always this sort of dichotomy between accountability and privacy. And so please, what do you think, should we look at it's the accountability aspect or privacy aspect? There is always this fight, this way that the 2 things should be some sort of balancing among themselves. So I see that privacy looks like more. Wow, okay, it's changing.
Yeah,
it's 50-50.
It's 50-50.
Accountability now is getting the lead. Okay, 10 more seconds. Let's see. Wow, accountability.
Ooh.
Okay, it's changing.
After an early lead for privacy.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
that's good. That's a good point, Bertrand. It could be both, indeed.
If I may, you use the word that I consciously encourage everybody to avoid.
Which of the 2?
Balancing.
Balancing.
The word is reconciling.
Okay, reconciling.
There are situations where the 2 conflict, but there are a lot of situations where you can have both. Because you can have a perfect protection of privacy, but the conditions under which the information is being released and made available is protective of rights and still efficient. So reconciling is a word that I strongly try to push in all those debates, because we have a tendency to think in a football match type of thing.
Yeah, and actually Peter Koch and also Michele are supporting that point of view from the chat, so thank you for raising that. Let's turn
Indeed.
to the next poll. Giovanni.
Yeah, so the next one is what should be tackled first. And we have registrant identification and accountability, blocking malicious registrations, fast response to complaints and incidents. So please express your preference for those 3 options. Okay, I can see that fast response to complaints and incidents is currently predominant.
And this is not an either or, this is sort of,
given
that you have to do everything,
yes.
What do you do first?
Yes, exactly. What do you do first? Okay.
Seems to be quite a clear message here.
Yes. Fast response is indeed the winner. That's I think we should move to the next one. And the next one is which one of these issues have you personally been confronted with? And we have, you can select as many as they apply to you. So we have counterfeit goods, online scam, intellectual property theft, false COVID information, phishing attempt, and spam. So which is the one that you were exposed and is not, again, one choice only, but as many as they apply to your case? So I can see phishing and spam and online scam. So counterfeit goods, moderately. And false COVID information, which proves what some of our speakers said, that when the entire pandemic exploded, internet was indeed there to help businesses and people. And the percentage of abuses relating to COVID was quite minor. Thank you so much for participating. We have one very last question. So when it comes to internet users, and again, I subscribe fully what Bertrand said earlier, that we have this choice between educating and protecting them, but the two things can go in parallel, especially if you are a technical operator. But let's see, okay, the education is currently, the winning option, but the education can come with some sort of protection or at least some tips so that internet users can protect themselves at different levels. So education is predominant in this case. So thanks a lot for participating, and let's move to the next block.
So we're opening up the floor to questions. I know this is one of the most sort of difficult aspects of doing these in a hybrid way, but we really do welcome your questions from the floor, from the Zoom chat room. But as you're thinking about those, just put them in the chat. But to get things started, maybe Bogdan, maybe I can come to you. Thank you for laying out the situation as you find it, but we've also heard from people in industry and also the internet and jurisdiction network. How do we get the balance? I'm not going to use the B word, but the sense of proportionality, because Michele's point was the internet has actually been our friend during the COVID. It's enabled us to work. So how do we protect people in a way that doesn't end up eliminating the benefits of the internet? Thank you.
This is quite challenging for us. As I told you, my team is dealing with the part of online threats of the intellectual property rights. So for us, the challenge is to educate the consumers and to try to keep them updated about the possible threats that they can face on the internet. And one of the challenges is to be able to create press releases that can make the people to understand what are the risks that they can expose when they are using this kind of abusing domains or abusing social media accounts, because we are speaking also about the social media accounts. It is another trend which is also visible. Also, we are creating campaigns on Europol website. You can find, we had one during the COVID pandemic, because during the COVID all the crime moved to online, because the criminals, they were staying at their houses and they needed to sell their products. They needed the IPTV exploded, as I can tell you as a trend. It's already the new trend in the IP crime in the past years. We are getting more and more cases. Everybody can get this kind of product, and of course the criminals are creating different domains to be able to advertise their criminal activity and to be able to address much more easier to the consumers or to the resellers. And due to this fact, we can see a lot of domains created during the pandemic. It was an explosion at the beginning. However, we managed to work on it. We had last year we closed around 25,000 websites that were infringing the IP rights in general, and also beside of this, we created different videos. We are trying also to create different campaigns, like our campaign "Don't Fake Up," which is related to the consumers and how they can access the internet, how they can distinguish between a website that can be a scam or can be selling counterfeit goods or can be involved in phishing activities. And of course, I was seeing your poll again, and it is quite good because I think we are doing a great job. Because I saw that the counterfeit goods are less sold on the internet, or I don't know what. So according to the spam, the phishing, and the online scam, it's much more addressing to the consumers than the counterfeiting. So at least me and my team, I think we are doing a great work.
You're winning. Yes,
and
thank you.
the law enforcement authorities that are working with us, of course, because it's a hard work behind.
Thank you very much. Of course, when we hear numbers like 25,000 or however many thousand, this goes to your point, Bertrand, the numbers are big, but as a proportion of the whole internet, this is very, very small. João, could I just turn to you, I mean, as a representative of EuroDIG's youth committee, and you were talking about how young people, this generation, you're probably the last who can remember what it was like before the internet became pervasive. For your generation, how significant a role does the domain name system play? I mean, isn't this just for old people? I mean, is it all social media? Is it all smart devices? And what do you think the young people of today, sorry, I know you can't speak for every young person, but what's your impression personally?
Now, it's a very interesting point and question, Emily. So thank you for also, first of all, for putting it out there. And it's something that I actually was discussing with Thomas backstage before coming in, because right now it's a bit like you also mentioned on the question, and like I put it on my previous explanation. So right now there's this pressure of young people to go and produce content, to have an online presence, and somehow social media have been the platforms that allow this to be as fast, as quick, as user-friendly as possible. And on the opposite side, you have the DNS system, you have web hosting, you have all these tools that are still too technical for the majority of young people to enter. We're even discussing that, for instance, when you have different web hostings, different registrars, different platforms, it's not the trivial experience that someone who just wants to produce content will want to experience. And in that sense, the consequence is that you end up using the mainstream platforms that everybody is using and everybody is consuming. There's obviously plenty of opportunities and advantages of owning our own domains, exploring our online identity in the way that we have control of the data that we are putting out there, because it stays under our web hosting and the website that we can create. And in that sense, I see there's still a bridge to cross, which is, in my opinion, and in a very to the point action to try to unify the experience of the different web hostings and domain name registrations. I think from there, young people will pick up on the pace of using domains and perhaps also avoid the social media platforms more mainstream.
Yeah, thanks for making that point, though, about how user-friendly the social media networks are, and in particular, I guess, their support for other languages and scripts as well, which is still a deficiency in the domain name system as a whole. Giovanni, you wanted the floor, so please.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I'd just like to ask a very practical question to Thomas and Michele about, you know, we had this poll about educating and protecting, And Michele in the chat wrote, that we should indeed teach people to fish. Concretely, what are the actions that you are doing to help your registrants, your customer, to be safer online and protect themselves? Because indeed, at some point, they should be enabled to understand what it means protect yourself. So Thomas first, and then Michele.
Excuse me. From our point of view, again, a lot of emphasis on prevention. As far as data accuracy is concerned, we monitor if, let's say, emails of our registrants become obsolete or bounced, so we contact them and notify them of this. But on the side of cybercrime and so on, I think it's crucial also to have a good relationship with authorities. In my experience, it took a lot of years to also educate the local authorities when we were cooperating, so that the response was faster, so that they even knew which data to ask from us, because the data which is entered in the WHOIS system is just a small portion of all the data that we have. Registrars have a lot of more information. We have to log certain information in order to prove the transactions and so on. So when the authorities contact us, it makes more sense for the authorities to have a very good relationship with registrars, because we can give them very valuable information. They can actually find the people who are behind the fraudulent activities. So I think that in my experience has improved a lot in recent years. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And indeed, education is at all levels for any kind of stakeholder, including authorities, public or private authorities. And speaking about authorities, Michele has an unrivaled experience in educating different kind of authorities and organizations. So Michele, what's your take with educating different kind of stakeholders?
So I think when it comes to education, it's obviously our first interest is going to be educating our clients and our potential clients. Because I mean, obviously, as a private company, we're motivated by money, the people who pay us. So we do a lot of content marketing and things like that around trying to communicate to people about some of the online risks. So, for example, Europol send out notices every Thursday with the latest kind of threats. So we get data from them and a couple other places. So we try to raise awareness about the various scams, be they smishing-based email, whatever, just to kind of let people know, hey, this is what's out there, this is what's bad. But then when it comes to engaging with law enforcement and others, I think it's important to have a dialogue with them, because I mean, a lot of the time we get people coming to us asking us for things that are completely irrelevant. I mean, things that we would never know about because it's not something that comes near us. I mean, in terms of the services we offer. So we have law enforcement guidelines that we published on our website, which lay out what the law enforcement need to bring us in order for us to be able to respond to their queries, but also outlining what kind of data we would actually hold or could hold. But I mean, ultimately, from our perspective, the education is also talking to other people and trying to understand. I mean, I think if you look at the polls you ran there a few minutes ago, one of the most popular responses was that it was the response time to threats and to issues. And a lot, in my own view, I think a lot of the issues we see where we're trying to forcing registrars and hosting providers and others to become like the internet police, the reason for that is because a lot of providers haven't responded in a timely fashion. It's like, in the real world, you police actions, you police crimes that have happened. The idea of pre-crime is just generally rejected. Yet for some bizarre reason, the concept of pre-crime and using some AI to somehow know that domain X is going to be used in some nasty way seems to be perfectly acceptable. I think that's something we'd be very, very careful about and push back on hard.
Thank you very much, Michele. I've got a question from Charles Shaban. Thank you for your question in the chat, and great to have you participating today. Charles, if you can get to your mic and put your camera on, please put your question.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everyone, for the wonderful information we got today. In fact, I want to build on the last question Giovanni put in the poll. about educating people. Maybe the majority chose to educate better than protect even. And as Joao mentioned when he talked, he mentioned that most of the new generation are used now to the social media, maybe more than other issues, and they don't have sometimes the basic technical, let's say, skills about knowing which site is correct, which information is correct. So just wanted to ask maybe Joao to start as the youngest generation and others, of course, what do you think the best way to educate our new generation, our kids and so on, how to know the correct data and not to believe anything they read, especially on the social media or social networks in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, Charles. Now, we haven't heard from Antoine or Bertrand recently. So, Antoine or Bertrand, would either of you like to tackle that question from Charles Chaban? Maybe I can start with you, Bertrand, for a few words, and then we can go to Antoine.
Well, actually, and hi, Charles. I wanted to highlight one thing that resonates with what Michele was saying. There's this sort of vision somewhere that there's this magic switchboard which has all the little buttons of all the domain names, and then when there's a problem on the internet, you just flip the switch, take down the domain, and everything is solved. Actually, it's completely wrong, because it's a whack-a-mole, the sites are still available, and it's not the right solution all the time. It's the solution sometimes, but not all the time. The second thing regarding education, I mean, I was joking with Joao privately during the discussion. On phishing, I'm sorry, after a certain while, you understand what looks like phishing. There's a part of the accommodation, and if you're in a city and you're going to a shady background, or if you have an amazing deal of a Canada Goose that is at a fifth or a tenth of the price, which is a real case that I was confronted with somebody who was complaining, my God, I ordered a Canada Goose for 20 euros and I was surprised that it was a fake when it arrived. I mean, sorry, just think about it. So the education goes all the way. It's part of the education of a new environment. What I want to highlight is the procedures and the interactions between the different actors. The answer to the question was responses, fast responses. The question is, again, the question of volume. If we do not automate the circulation of information between the law enforcement, the notifiers, and the operators in a way that doesn't prejudge the decision that they're going to make, but that organizes the due process and so on, we will never be able to tackle this, because the key issue is cooperation. We should really, and I finish with this, we should really get out in this field, just like in content moderation or other issues, out of this notion of throwing responsibility at others, like governments saying the companies are not doing what they should, companies complaining that the governments are over-regulating. This is our common problem as a society, and we need to coordinate and cooperate with the appropriate tools, and there's still too much mistrust between the actors, so they need to get together.
Yeah, thank you. Antoine, can I turn to you either on Charles's question or just, maybe for your comments and reflections, having heard some fairly, trenchant remarks from some of the industry members. Are we getting it wrong? How do we work more closely together? How do we get that cooperation more functional and more rapid?
Thanks for the question. Well, I think that what we were trying to achieve with the discussion paper we released on best practices or good practices from registrar and registry to prevent the use of domain name for IP infringing activities. We look through the domain name lifecycle and we identify 12 areas of best practices or good practices, and we see that there's all different kind of practices that can be implemented at the different stage of the domain name lifecycle to prevent some kind of misuse. Now, we had discussion so this discussion paper is the outcome of discussion we had with an expert group where we had representatives from all different kind of stakeholders, including a registrar, registry, domain name, and I think the paper highlights the limit of some of the good practice, the benefits of some of the good practice, and it's some kind of toolkit that can be used. It's not saying that one best practice is necessarily the one that is going to solve the issue, or that one good practice can be implemented by all type of player, because depending on their technical means, depending on their financial means, they are not all appropriate. But really looking at it as some kind of toolbox where registrar and registry can look at good practices that can be put in place to undermine the misuse of domain name for IP infringing activities.
Thank you very much for that. Now, we're just on the last seconds of this session. Just to wrap up, you know, we're great in policy at talking about the problems and all of the issues. That's what we like to do. But what I'd like to ask each one of our panel, and also you as the audience, is to complete this sentence in as few words as possible, which is, I know things are improving when. Tomasz, can I start with you? Or would you like me to start with someone else? This is like a menu in the restaurant. João, why don't you start? Thank you.
So the line, the start of the phrase is...
I will know things are improving when...
When we keep preparing for the worst, but we hope for the best.
Thank you. Can I come to you, Michele, next?
So I suppose when the sun is shining and I can actually see you all in person and have a nice glass of wine. I suppose in terms of the cyber stuff, which is probably what you're asking about, I think, you know, the day that the IP interests will stop demanding crazy stuff from me, then I will be super positive.
Well, I can't go to anyone else next except for you, Antoine. You will know when things are improving when... Say something nasty about Michele.
I'm not. I know things are working when, well, people that are represent different interests talk to each other and understand what can be done and what cannot be done, and are working together to put in place effective measure to undermine DNS abuse. And I think that's what we really need, and I think that's what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Antoine. Very diplomatic, I may say. Can I come to you, Tomasz?
Yeah, sure. I agree with Antoine. I think when the right questions are starting to pop up and the discussions are there, things start to improve, because communication, I think, is the key. And also in my experience, when we started communicating also with the authorities and all the other participants, things started to improve, because each cycle that you go through, there's an improvement. Everyone has more knowledge, more experience, and everything goes smoother.
Thank you for that. Bogdan, I will know when things, from your perspective in law enforcement, you will know when things are improving. When?
When we'll meet again, all of us, and we will be able to come up with a solution, or this is the purpose, more or less, to meet and to work and to try to be all of us involved more and more in this risk.
Thank you. And Bertrand, I will always give you the last word, please. You will know when things are improving from your perspective.
Well, it will not surprise Michele or people who participate in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, because the answer is what we've been saying over and over again. I know that things will improve when people, notifiers, law enforcement, and operators sit around the table understanding that they have a problem in common rather than a problem with each other. And I see that evolving, actually, and I'm extremely happy about the work that is being done and led to the toolkits, because it's exactly going in that direction. They are bad actors, and we are all in to really react to them and prevent this, instead of throwing blame and responsibilities to each other.
Thank you. Well said, Bertrand. Giovanni,
Yeah.
When will you know that things have improved?
When I can have, certainly when I can have a fully in-person session of whatever EuroDIG organizes.
Very well said. Now, this brings our session to a close. I mean, obviously, there's so much that we could have spoken about. I would really like to thank all of our panelists, Bogdan, Antoine, Michele, for joining us remotely today, and Joao, Bertrand, and Tomasz for making the journey, and also the amazing team at EuroDIG and you, Giovanni, for inviting us and putting on this session for the Dynamic Coalition. Giovanni.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily, for being an excellent moderator and co-host of this session. This indeed brings us to the end of the Dynamic Coalition session on data and trust. Last year, when we launched the Dynamic Coalition session on data and trust, we wanted it really to be a dynamic coalition that meets several times a year with several calls, with several engagement opportunities for all the stakeholders who want to know more and who want to deepen their understanding of the concept of data and trust in our internet environment. I'm very happy to have heard so many positive, let's say, comments and input about what internet can do for our lives. And it's true that at some point, there might be some small issues, but, if we want to be binary in this case, and we put the good on one hand and the not so good on the other, we'll see that the good on one hand, what comes good from the internet is much, the weight is much bigger than the not so good. So thanks a lot. So it's really good what we have heard today. That said, thank you so much to the tech crew. Thanks Trieste for having us. It was, again, a bit challenging to organize a hybrid, in-person virtual meeting, but we made it possible. Thank you to EuroDIG for hosting our session at the very beginning of a fruitful EuroDIG meeting, which is going to roll out in the next 2 days. The Dynamic Coalition on Data and Trust will soon get back together, certainly during the IGF, Internet Governance Forum, later this year in December, and earlier with some calls to catch up on those matters. That said, Internet will and remain united. That's the motto of the next IGF. Thank you, everybody, for having us. Thank you again, Trieste. That's all.